You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of Indications, a podcast series by the Conference Board. Indications are conversations that take an objective, fact-based look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best, provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Sara Murray, Managing Director International for the Conference Board and host of this podcast. Today's conversation will focus on From the Frontline reporting in Ukraine. Our guest today is Jerome Starkey, an English journalist, broadcaster and author, best known for covering wars and the environment. Jerome spent several years reporting in Afghanistan, initially working for NATO's International Security Assistance Force, and then freelance for a range of broadcasters and newspapers, including Sky News, France 24 and The Independent, where he challenged US forces over civilian casualties in Afghanistan. He then moved to The Times in Kenya and was later deported after reporting on state-sponsored corruption and extrajudicial killings. He is currently defense editor at The Sun, reporting on the Ukraine-Russia war, and is going to share his experiences on the front line in Ukraine. Welcome, Jerome.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, welcome. So given your background relevant to this issue, can you share what you've been doing in the past few days and weeks?
Yeah, of course. So I've just come back from Ukraine and I was there for nearly 5 weeks, reporting on the build-up to the conflict. And I have to say I was one of the people who couldn't believe it was really actually going to happen. And then when it did start, I found myself right in the far east of the government-controlled territory on what was the old front line. And then so since then, in the last 2.5, nearly 3 weeks, I've been traveling over huge parts of the country. Ukraine is a huge country, traveling around to various different front lines to try and report on what's been happening in places as far apart as Kharkiv in the northeast and Zaporizhia in the south.
And what are some of the challenges facing the civic population that you're observing?
Oh, well, the challenges are immense and almost impossible, I think, to go through them all. But I mean, essentially, there at one level, you have the unique challenges of that conflict brings, the risk of violent death. I mean, their homes are being bombarded, roads are being attacked, closed, they're getting shot at. So just staying where they are becomes very dangerous. Attempting to move becomes very dangerous. But then there's a whole level of sort of secondary effects of conflict. And this is where conflict just impacts on normal life. And I suppose that's perhaps most evident in a place like perhaps Mariupol in the southeast, which is this city that's under siege. And that's where, shops start to run out of food, petrol stations start to run out of fuel, hospitals start to run out of drugs. There's no electricity, there's no gas for central heating. So suddenly just the basic things that you need to stay alive, like food and warmth and shelter and water, are not available. And that's not necessarily because you're on a front line, but that's because of these sort of secondary effects of the conflict, or perhaps in the case of Mariupol, this is a primary intention. This is a deliberate effect of the siege. But it's not just happening in Mariupol, it's happening everywhere. And certainly in the places that I was in, I saw shops partially stocked. We saw huge queues outside petrol stations. So things like when we were moving around, those sorts of logistical challenges were always at the back of our mind, making sure we did have the resources or could find the resources we needed in order to do our job safely.
Mm. And several of our member companies, have been arranging convoys or donating to NGOs with regards to humanitarian assistance. Do you see evidence of that assistance getting through? Is there anything more that needs to be done on the ground?
Well, I was primarily in the east, northeast and sort of the southeast of the country, but essentially a long way from Ukraine's safe and open land borders, if you like. So broadly speaking, Ukraine is a huge country, and that is both a challenge and an advantage in the current circumstances. And the reason I say it's a challenge is because distances are huge, so logistics is a challenge. The reason it's an advantage is it means for an invading country like Russia, they have to cross those huge distances, which gives the defenders an advantage because any advancing country invading countries, exposing itself across these huge logistical distances, and that gives the defenders a chance to attack their supply lines. But I'm getting slightly distracted. In terms of have I seen aid, my understanding is that most of the aid which is getting through is primarily arriving in Western Ukraine from neighboring countries like Poland, like Hungary, like Slovakia, like Romania. In the far east where I was, or at least the sort of Middle East of the country where I was, I didn't see particularly strong evidence of that aid arriving, no. But having said that, most of the people where I was were fleeing westwards. So hopefully what you'll be seeing is a convergence, a marrying up of the aid coming in from the west and the people arriving from the east, and they should come together where it's needed most in those sort of ad hoc settlements, refugee camps, transit hubs in both Western Ukraine and Eastern Poland.
So several media outlets have remarked on the self-determination and the spirit of the Ukrainian people in defending their sovereign territory. From your point of view, what's the morale of the Ukrainian people and the armed forces, and any observations of the morale of the Russian forces?
Well, I was much better placed to see the morale of the Ukrainians because obviously I was living among them for those 5 weeks, and it's extraordinary. They are facing an existential threat. There's no denying that. There's this enormous and powerful army and neighboring country trying to overrun Ukraine, trying to destroy the country as they know it, change its government, change their way of life. And yet, despite this enormous existential threat, people remain remarkably upbeat. There's a sort of grim determination. They're not naive. They're not ignoring or denying the scale of the threat they're facing. Quite the opposite. They're rising to meet it. And you see that spirit, that the morale, the determination in many, many different ways. It could just be people ending normal conversations with Slava Ukraina, which means glory to Ukraine, or one of the things that really got me was around Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia, these cities I was in, there were posters going up, road signs going up, and they were emblazoned with fairly crude messages, some saying Russian warship, go F yourself. Now that's really significant because that, I don't know if I can swear on this podcast, Sarah, but anyway, you get the message. That has become the rallying cry of the resistance, because on the first day of the war, there was a band of about 12 border guards who were outnumbered and outgunned by a Russian warship. These border guards were on a little island called Snake Island in the Black Sea, and they were ordered to surrender by a massive Russian warship. And over the unencrypted open frequency ship-to-shore radios that they were using to communicate, instead of surrendering, these border guards said to the Russian warship, "Go F yourself." At which point they were bombarded and believed dead. And so they're kind of, what we thought were their last words became sort of immortalized immediately. And that's one of the things about this conflict, is the speed that information travels. And anyway, that message has now been emblazoned over billboards. I saw it on soldiers' T-shirts. I saw it painted on tank traps and concrete barriers, which are being used to man checkpoints and close roads. And it's sort of indicative of the spirit of resistance, because the spirit of resistance is not just fierce, but it does come with a sort of wry gallows humor. And people are, not only are they determined to fight the Russians, but they're determined to do it with a sort of smile on their face. And you see that in many different ways as well. I also saw road signs which they looked like a road sign with sort of 3 different arrows pointing in different directions. But at the end of each arrow, it said, turn Russia F off. Straight ahead, it was like Russia F off again. And then there was a U-turn. It was like Russia F off back to Russia. So, they're making a joke of it, but nonetheless conveying a fairly strident and determined view.
Indeed. So given what we know today about the Russian invasion, what is your opinion on his plan here?
Well, I think what we've seen is a significant change in tactics, and we're led to believe, I think it's very convincing, that Russia's ambitions was for a lightning offensive, a sort of blitzkrieg war to capture the capital, Kiev, decapitate the government, possibly by assassinating President Zelensky, and then installing some sort of Moscow-friendly, Kremlin-friendly regime. that hasn't happened. That plan has been scotched at absolutely every stage by ferocious Ukrainian resistance. And so the way it was described to me is that perhaps people had expected to see a Russian Viper strike, really quick, really powerful, straight, delivering a knockout blow. That hasn't happened. In fact, the offensive was described to me more like that of a worm than a viper. And so what you've seen instead is Russia change tactics. You've seen them go from attempting to be a viper to becoming a boa constrictor. And so what they're doing is, instead of launching direct assaults into cities, they're trying to surround them. They're starving them of resources. We've seen that particularly in Mariupol in the southeast. We've seen it to a lesser extent in Kharkiv and Kiev, the capital, in the north. But essentially there what you're seeing is these huge, large Russian armored columns moving into positions around these cities, and an increased reliance on long-range aerial bombardment. That's alarming. It's very alarming, because it appears to indicate a shift towards tactics which Russia has used in previous conflicts, significantly when they were supporting President Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And we saw what happened to places like Aleppo. And also we've seen what happened to cities like Grozny in the Chechen wars, just absolutely devastated and destroyed. We're already seeing that in parts of Mariupol. We're already seeing that in neighborhoods outside Kiev, and we're already seeing that in Kharkiv, cities absolutely destroyed. This is quite hard to reconcile with what we've heard from the Russian state, from Vladimir Putin, this idea that they would be welcomed as liberators by the Ukrainians, because somehow the Russians are turning up to throw off a fascist yoke. Flattening cities is certainly not going to make the Russians welcome to sort of no one is coming out with garlands of flowers after they've seen their homes, their hospitals, their schools destroyed.
Chilling. You've commented on iodine tablets being distributed in the event of a nuclear attack. How big do you think the threat of a chemical or a nuclear attack is?
Well, there's two things. There's the risk of a nuclear accident as a result of the conflict. Now, Ukraine clearly has very close experience of the world's worst nuclear disaster, when the Chernobyl plant, there was a meltdown at the Chernobyl plant north of Kiev. So they take these things quite rightly. They take these things very seriously. And what we've seen during this conflict is two situations where the sort of nuclear risk has been increased. We've seen that firstly at Chernobyl, where there was fighting over Chernobyl, and then more recently there has been arguments over whether or not the power has been turned on or turned off to the Chernobyl plant. It needs electricity to maintain the processes that keep the damaged reactors cool, to stop any sort of further meltdown. The second thing we've seen is at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant down towards the south of the country, and that's where I was about 10 days ago. There was fighting over the plant. One of the reactors was struck by a shell. It has 6 reactors. It's the largest power plant in Europe. One of the plants was struck by a shell, but not significantly damaged. And in fact, these reactors, I'm led to believe, are sort of built to be incredibly resilient to outside external damage. Nonetheless, the fact that there is fighting, state-on-state fighting between two armies which have heavy artillery and aircraft at their disposal, the fact that they're fighting over a nuclear power station is clearly something that alarmed a lot of people, not just locally, but around the world. Locally, they took it very seriously. I went to a town of about 50,000 people, which is just on the opposite bank of the river from that power station. And as you said, the mayor there had started to issue iodine tablets. Now, iodine is effectively an anti-radiation tablet that you take to try and limit if you're exposed to radiation. You can take these iodine tablets to try and limit the harmful effects of radiation. It's a precautionary measure that you have to take within, I think, a certain time period of radiation exposure, and then continue to take them. The fact that the mayor had taken that precaution and was issuing those tablets to the 50,000 residents in that town, I think, I mean, it really hit home to me, because sometimes you wonder whether actually these concerns are just hyperbole, that a bit sort of rhetoric being ramped up in foreign capitals, being ramped up by the media, but actually to go there and to see the people who really are most at risk of something going wrong, taking these sort of sensible, but almost also very sort of small precautions, because there's not much they can do. But the fact that they were taking these precautions really brought home how seriously they were taking it. The mayor did also say, he said, look, we have an evacuation plan. We've had an evacuation plan for years because we live next to a nuclear power plant. Of course we would. But he said, we're also aware that given the fact we're in a conflict, given the fact we're in a war, we will not have the result. If we need to evacuate, it will be impossible. So the iodine tablets are the best hope we've got. One thing I was sorry, just to come back on your question about chemical war as well, chemical conflict as well. So the other and on nuclear, the other nuclear risk is there has been some suggestion, well, that this conflict could escalate into a nuclear war, and that could happen in two ways. I hope that these are both incredibly remote possibilities. One is a suggestion that if Putin's forces continue to be bogged down and unable to achieve their objectives using conventional military means, that he may resort to using what is called a tactical nuclear weapon. And that is effectively a small nuclear weapon that can nonetheless cause devastating damage in a sort of relatively confined area, in order to crush the spirit, morale, or indeed resistance of the opposing force. The second fear of a nuclear conflict is that this escalates into a Russia versus NATO conflict that becomes World War III, and then that becomes, nuclear weapons are introduced into that, and that leads us down the path of mutually assured destruction. And as I say, I do think that is a slim possibility, a very slim possibility, but it explains why NATO and Western leaders are treading carefully when it comes to how they support Ukraine and what weapons they provide, and why they haven't enforced a no-fly zone. In terms of the chemical risk, the risk of chemical weapons, both sides have accused the other of plotting a chemical attack, and then both sides have accused the other of plotting a false flag chemical attack. So that means the Ukrainians think the Russians are going to launch a chemical attack, but blame it on them, and the Russians vice versa. Now, there was a lot of this talk before the war started. There was concerns particularly in the West and in Ukraine, that Russia was going to perhaps target a water filtration plant where there's a lot of chlorine gas, damage it, release the gas, cause mass destruction, but blame it on the Ukrainians and use that as a trigger for conflict. They found a different route to start the war. They didn't use a chemical false flag attack, but nonetheless, the fact that both sides are accusing each other means that it remains something that people are worried about, and something to keep an eye on. As far as we know, it has not happened yet.
We've talked about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, the challenges the civic population are observing, whether humanitarian aid is getting through, and thoughts on Russia's ultimate game plan. Next, we'll look at what it takes to be a combat journalist. We're going to take a short break and be right back with more of my conversation with Jerome.
Interested in more insights on the current Russian-Ukrainian crisis? Visit our geopolitics hub at conferenceboard.org/topics/geopolitics. Here you can find a range of easily accessible insights in the form of webcasts, podcasts, research briefs, and more. New resources are being added regularly to help you lead with confidence.
Welcome back to Indications podcast. I'm your host, Sara Murray, Managing Director International of the Conference Board, and I'm joined by Jerome Starkey. So, Jerome, we've heard Zelensky repeatedly ask the West to ensure a no-fly zone. You just said what you think to that. What's your take on the likelihood of additional support from the West, and kind of what form do you think that would take?
Well, NATO's ruled out no-fly zone because they say that the only way to enforce that would be for NATO planes to shoot down Russian planes, and that would then effectively put them toe-to-toe in a direct conflict with Russia. They're walking this tightrope. Nonetheless, they want to try and support Ukraine. Now, the way we've seen that happen so far has been principally with simple shoulder-to-launch anti-tank missiles. Britain, the United States, a number of Scandinavian countries, and others have supplied a large number of different missiles. They range from Javelin missiles, which are quite complicated to use, but incredibly effective with a range of about 2.5 kilometers, to the British-made Anglo-Swedish Enlarge anti-tank missiles. These have the advantage of being incredibly easy to use. Almost anyone can learn how to do it. They're fire and forget missiles. You point it at the tank, pull the trigger, and it does the rest. Now, they have both proven very effective already in destroying a huge amount of Russian armor. And we've also seen supplies of Stinger surface-to-air missiles. Now, Stingers had a devastating effect on the Soviet army when they were in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. The Americans supplied them then to the anti-Russian resistance fighters who were fighting the Soviet army. They're being supplied to the Ukrainian armed forces as well. So far, that Western support, at least the sharpest end of that Western support, is coming in the form of those missiles. I'm led to believe it's being backed up by a steady flow of intelligence. The West is directing a lot of its intelligence gathering assets at Ukraine at the moment to track Russian movements, to intercept Russian communications, to understand their intentions and their capabilities. And that information is invaluable to Ukraine's defenders as they plot how best to thwart Russia's ambitions and how best to cripple the army in the field. And what we've seen is, whilst Russia has generally been this sort of lumbering juggernaut of an army, sending huge amounts of soldiers and armor in a relatively conventional fashion, Ukrainian forces have remained agile and nimble. And they've gone in small teams, they've used drones, they've used these missiles, and they've ambushed the Russian forces on terrain of their choosing. And that's perhaps why we've seen them have such remarkable success.
And any views on how this all ends?
That's a really good question. I mean, when I left 48 hours ago, I was torn. I mean, because I thought, this could end in 2 weeks or 2 years. There is a school of thought which says that the Russians are running low on resources. They've committed a huge amount, about 65% of their total combat power has been committed in or immediately around Ukraine. Russia military experts who understand their strengths and capabilities much better than I do have suggested that they cannot sustain this level of conflict at this intensity for very long. Now, that may explain why there are reports that Russian negotiators are being more realistic in the talks with Ukrainian negotiators than they were at the start of the conflict. There's a sense that perhaps the Russians can't sustain. They've lost at least 7,000 soldiers, according to sort of conservative Western estimates, over 12,500 if you believe the Ukrainian numbers, hundreds of tanks, more than, probably about 200 aircraft, including jets and helicopters, and over 1,000 armored personnel carriers, according to Ukraine's tally. Now, all of those numbers have to be taken with a pinch of salt, but what is certainly clear is that this has been an incredibly bloody and expensive campaign. Much more so perhaps than the Russians were expecting. So in terms of how does it end? Wars always ultimately end with some form of negotiated settlement, unless there's a sort of outright victory, but even that will lead to some sort of settlement. I think it's increasingly difficult to see a Russian victory, because at best, even if they took all of Ukraine's territory, which remains vast, and whilst they have made headway, they still only control a tiny percentage of Ukraine's territory. Even if they controlled all of it, they would be facing an insurgency that would be well motivated, resourced, and armed by the West. That would be a nightmare scenario for any Russian government. So therefore, we have to ask, what do they want to achieve? And crucially, can they present what they have achieved as a victory. Now, we've already seen in Russia a sort of change of tone in the state media, suggestions already that they've achieved their objectives, suggestions that they've already degraded Ukraine's armed forces to such an extent that it's no longer a threat. We're hearing suggestions now that the negotiators are talking about possible neutrality, that Ukraine might be willing to drop its ambition of joining NATO. All of these things could be presented by the Kremlin to the Russian public as a victory. Now, that's important because both sides have to be able to present the outcome as a victory in order for it to be a politically acceptable solution. From Ukraine's point of view, if they can get Russian forces to retreat from their soil, then that is undeniably a victory. The underdog will have won. They will have held off an assault by one of the world's greatest militaries, completely bucking the world's expectations.
So you've been a combat journalist now for several years. How do you cope with all of the horror that you see daily? How are you coping now?
That's a good question. I'm acutely aware that I'm very lucky in the sense that I do see these horrific things, but I'm not forced to make the same horrific decisions that people who are caught up in this conflict do. So, when I left, I joined this human exodus of 2.5 million people who've left Ukraine and 2 million people who've been internally displaced. But I wasn't wrenching my family apart. I mean, one of the hardest things I saw while I was there was not the buildings destroyed or the bodies in the snow. It was actually seeing dads on the train station in Zaporizhia saying goodbye to their wives and their children who were leaving on the train. Now, it was mostly women and children who were leaving, and it was men who were staying behind to fight. And to watch these families wrenching themselves apart, I saw a dad drawing a heart in the dirty glass on the train carriage. His wife and his daughters were inside, and he was on the platform outside speaking to them, just a yard away, but speaking to them on his mobile phone and not knowing whether he would see them again. They didn't even know where the train was going. They just knew it was going west, and west was towards safety. That was incredibly hard. Families are wrenching themselves apart. When I left Ukraine, I was acutely aware that I wasn't heading into the unknown. I wasn't a refugee. I was heading home. I was heading towards my loved ones to reunite my family. So from that point of view, I'm very lucky. And whilst we do expose ourselves as journalists to some unpleasant things and some significant risks, what we endure is nothing compared to what the people who have no choice, the people who are, whose homes are in Ukraine, whose families are in Ukraine, it's 1,000 times worse for them.
It's heartbreaking for them. Yeah. And what security measures are in place to protect you? How do you stay safe while you're there?
Well, we have a range of different measures, which ranges from planning, regular communications, and you have to trust your instincts. I mean, essentially, what we do is we try and work out where we're going, what the risk is. We try and mitigate it. We carry things like body armor, first aid kits. We're all trained on how to do some fairly, I wouldn't say advanced, but fairly sort of significant trauma first aid. So it's slightly more than a St. John's ambulance course. It includes things like how to deal with catastrophic bleeds and blast injuries and things like that. And we consider the risk, and we do what we can. We do what we can to mitigate them. But ultimately, of course, we put ourselves at some risk. And I think we've seen in this conflict already, at least 3 journalists have been killed. At least 2 others have been very seriously wounded. It's impossible. I mean, it's almost inevitable, I think, in a conflict of this scale, with the number of journalists covering it as there are, that sadly, these things are going to happen. It's not without, covering a conflict is not without risk. And whilst we take as many steps as we can to mitigate them, we also know that we have to put ourselves in harm's way to do the job properly.
Jerome, I can't thank you enough for coming here today and sharing with our listeners, what you've been seeing on the front line. Thank you so much for the incredible work that you're doing to spread the message about what you're seeing. And thanks to all of you for listening to the Indications podcast. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by experts to provide insights on this issue. We'll cover leading topics in public policy, economic impacts, human capital implications, cybersecurity, supply chains, and ESG leadership. Please share the Indications podcast with your colleagues. You can find it on theconferenceboard.org/podcasts. I'm Sara Murray, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.